We're back at the Weiss Watch Company workshop, and we've got another Q&A episode for you. We got a really good list of questions today. Some totally different questions than I've seen before, which always makes me excited. So let's get started. Are there any current employment positions open at Weiss Watch Company? And what characteristics are you looking for with future employees? That is a good question. First off, I'm always looking for people. It's an industry where it's hard to find people unless you're willing to train from zero, which I don't really have the luxury of time to do that. So for me, I'm really looking for people who already have some experience. You might not have to be a certified watchmaker with all the training and different brand certifications. However, if I was to hire a watchmaker, I need to know that they could at least take apart and put back together a simple movement without doing damage. From there, that'd be a good starting point for a watchmaker's apprentice. Currently, I'm looking for watchmakers that could be an apprentice, not starting from nothing, starting from some kind of level where they can work without damaging parts. I'm also looking for CNC operators, machinists, and administrative and customer service help. But all of these positions are pretty unique in the US. So it's tricky to find people with experience that are willing to come in and do these somewhat unique jobs for us. How are the watch dials for your watches made? I believe you told that they are not made in your shop, but I would like to know how they are made and printed, and if you do some kind of finishing. So when I first started, I did make the dials myself from a raw piece of brass that I would machine. And then from there, I would do the paint work and a special printing process to get the numbers on there, the brand logo, and all the details. However, I don't really like working with paint or ink. It's very messy, and we use very little ink. But in order to do the printing of a watch dial, I would have to mix a decent amount of ink, and then I have to clean all of the ink out of the machine. So I felt like I was constantly covered in ink all over my hands and having to clean up after printing. So I found some partners that are able to do that work for me, and now I focus on just machining the blank dial. The dials are made of brass, and then from there, we can do paint and printing. The printing is a special process called pad printing. This process involves first etching a plate. We fill the etching with ink. Then we use a silicone stamp to pick that ink up by dropping the stamp and pressing it on that etched plate with ink. It transfers to the bottom of that silicone pad. Then we move our dial underneath it. Now the dial has to already be painted at that point, and then we can deposit that transfer of ink onto the dial. We can do that a few times in order to make a nice thick coating, as long as we have everything very precise. As far as finishing goes, at this point, what I'm doing is sending out the brass blanks to a company that does paint work and also does the printing. They specialize in printing for automotive industry. So things like buttons inside of automobiles and inside of the cockpit of an airplane, things that have different logos and symbols, some dash components for cars, window buttons, things like that. and they're here in the US, and they will do the paintwork and the printing. I receive them back here, and I can do the final quality control. But ideally, at that point, there should be no additional finishing necessary. What would it take for your watch to be completely USA made? Yeah, that's a really good question. US made is an interesting designation. There's no clear guidelines for the watch industry. If you look at the automotive industry, there are very clear guidelines. If you look at clothing, guidelines are there, very clear on exactly what content you need to have in your product for it to be made in USA. Same thing with appliances. All of these industries have big groups behind them that are pushing to make sure that they know exactly where they stand with the government when they label their product made in USA. So they want to know exactly the percentage of content from the material, the weight of the material, the cost of the processing of the material, all of these things. They need to be able to calculate exactly when they can call a product US made, because they're a large industry. We don't have that luxury in the watchmaking industry here in the US because there is no watchmaking industry. So for us, we have to set our own guidelines. And that's where it gets confusing. The guidance from the government is all or virtually all made in the USA. What that means to different people is different. So for me, I think that virtually all means almost all of the watch is made in the USA. And we do have a watch that we market as US made because we make almost all of it, or virtually all of the components that go into it, here in the US. On the other hand, there are people who believe that everything down to the molecules of material that are being turned into watch components, those molecules must come from the soil here in the US. So that's a very different approach. And there are materials that simply cannot be mined here in the US. There are no suppliers for those materials. There are also things that are very complex, like hairsprings. Hairsprings can be made in the US. Hairsprings could be made in this factory right here that I'm sitting in. The complex part really comes into play when you want to produce many hairsprings that you can assemble into a watch. The hairspring itself is a very inexpensive part. Pairing of a hairspring to a balance wheel, that's where the cost comes into play. So in my workshop, I don't believe that a hairspring is that important until the craftsperson, the specialist, actually takes that hairspring and pairs it perfectly with a balance wheel. So if I make the balance wheel here in my workshop, and then I pair a Swiss hairspring to it, that is the watchmaking. That is what I consider most important, because the knowledge, the tools, the skill required to pair those two items so that they actually keep precise time, that is the difference. The raw hairspring itself doesn't require anything special. It's simply a piece of wire that's been rolled into a coil by a machine. That coil will not keep time. It will do nothing. They are so cheap, we can throw away 50 of them to make one good balance wheel and hairspring pair. Rolex has a watch with a third hand for a second time zone. Is that hard to do? Do you have a watch that does that? So there are a couple things involved in adding that extra hand. So that would be an extra hour hand. And that hour hand, in the case of that particular Rolex, the Rolex Explorer, that watch, that hand will rotate around the dial once every 24 hours. That isn't particularly hard to add. What gets a little complex is integrating it into the setting mechanism of the watch so that you're able to change that hand and have it jump from hour to hour. That's where it becomes complex. Greenwich Mean Time needs a 24-hour reading around the dial. Now that hour hand is connected to the minutes of the watch, and that hand can jump and advance hour by hour. You can also change the time on the other hour hand, which is directly connected to the minute hand. So you're able to track 2 time zones there and see the difference very easily. I don't make a watch that is a GMT complication. However, I would like to in the future. I have an Omega MK40 from New. I used to run the chronograph all the time until I heard you tell Matt Farah on your old YouTube show, Watch and Listen, that running it all the time is hard on the watch. The question is, how hard is running the chronograph on the watch itself, and why would you maybe not want to do that? So I think the best way to think about it is with the analogy of a car. If you have a car and you drive it in 4-wheel drive all the time, there are components that are going to have additional wear because you're using them when they're not really necessary. That's how a chronograph is on your watch. There's an additional gear train that will move the hands associated with the chronograph. Now, there's also the start-stop mechanism. But if we're talking about simply turning the chronograph on so that you have a second hand, the big second hand, sweeping around the watch all the time, some people like that because they see that the watch is running rather than having to look at the tiny little second hand that is the running second hand. And it's okay to do that. The toughest part on a chronograph is the start and stop. That's really rough on a chronograph. So if you're always starting and stopping without really needing to, just fidgeting maybe and playing with the start, stop, and reset mechanism, that can be really tough on the chronograph. The rest of the gear train that is for the chronograph will constantly be turning if you have the chronograph engaged. So you're adding a number of wheels in there that wouldn't normally be spinning 24/7, 365, and you are having them turn all the time. So that's where the additional wear will come from. If you're regularly servicing your watch so that it's clean and has fresh oil, it really isn't a big deal. Richard Mille watches seem pretty ostentatious and gimmicky to me. I think that's their intentional jam. Have you had one in your hands, and is the quality immediately evident? Do you think they will be highly collectible in 2060, like old Rolexes are today? First thing, I would not compare Richard Mille to Rolex in any way. Rolex produces 1 million watches a year, and they have been producing 1 million watches a year for decades. Richard Mille produces less than 5,000 watches a year. They're also much more expensive to begin with. And they make many complicated watches. So they're 2 very different brands with very different audiences. A lot of people can afford a Rolex. Very few people can afford an RM. I look at RM as more of an art piece and an exercise in engineering and some really intricate watchmaking. The R&D that goes into their watches is split between a really small production run. So in order to recoup those R&D costs with a small production run, the watches will inherently be much more expensive. I have held them in my hands, and I can say that they are very high quality. They look and they feel like very fine watches. You have to understand what you're looking at most of the time because they use some really new age materials for the watchmaking world, that is. So sometimes you might find that a large watch of theirs that you would think should be heavy because of how expensive it is actually so light that it feels like a toy. It feels like plastic. But to then look deeper and see that the bridges of the movement are made from titanium, the case is made of magnesium, all these different things. Maybe it's skeletonized to a point where there's almost no material. This all adds to the intrigue. So I don't think that their watches are overpriced, but they're also not intended to be mass market timepieces. And that's what Rolex is intended to be. So I don't think you can necessarily compare the collectability of a Rolex, a vintage Rolex, with the potential collectability of an RM. Because the vintage Rolex is collectible simply because they didn't survive. Even though they were made in large numbers, many of them got to a point in their useful life where they were trashed. A. Lang & Söhne has an ad for their Datograph Perpetual that they say they assemble every watch twice. Do other watchmakers follow the same practice? And how many hours does that take to take it apart and put it back together, not including the fine-tuning and the finishing? They are one of the few companies that publicizes that aspect of fine watchmaking. It's actually a pretty standard practice when you're producing complicated or what will be considered small run watches. So again, a company like ALS, they produce less than 5,000 watches a year, many of which are highly complex, with some of the highest finishing of serially produced watches. So these are really beautifully finished watches that are also very complex. What that means is when they receive the parts from the manufacturers of the components, there is a watchmaker that receives that kit. The watchmaker will assemble that kit, and as they are assembling it, they will have to make modifications. Because with the lower volume, it is really hard to take a watch that might have 500 or 600 pieces in it and make sure that every single piece is perfect, straight from the machine shop. And that's just talking about the fit and the function, making sure that a spring is the right tension, a surface is smooth enough to allow for a jump to happen, the meshing of wheels is right, the placement of jewels is at the right height. All of these things have to be done by a watchmaker. Because the volume is small, the tolerances are tight, and the production is not perfect because it's not designed for automated assembly. So just getting all of these parts to work properly and have the movement run, that's step one. And doing that, you wouldn't want to do that with completely finished, polished, decorated parts, because you're going to be modifying them. And to be honest, that movement will probably be assembled and disassembled part way many times, because you can't always make a change to one thing without disassembling more things. And during that process, you don't want a screw to be damaged. You don't want a decorative surface to be scratched. So you wait to do all of that finishing until the end. Once you have a perfectly running machine, that's when it will be disassembled and those components will be refinished to be perfect, flawless. And at that point, they'll go through assembly again with the focus solely on assembling it clean without leaving any trace, no damage, no scratches, nothing that looks like anything. No tool ever touched this watch, right? It should be flawless at that point. And this process really depends on how perfect the components are when they reach the first watchmaker. If the components are really very close, and it's just a matter of setting jewel heights and end shakes and making sure that the fitment is right, then everything should go together within a day, maybe half a day, if someone's very skilled in that particular caliber. Beyond that, the decoration of that many parts will take many days. Could be weeks, depending on which movement you're talking about. The final assembly should be less than a day once those parts are all finished and need to come together. In a shop full of the right tools, it would be fun as a viewer to see you, a master watchmaker, take apart and service a watch with a $30 set of tools that a DIY person might use. I really like that idea. And I think that even with inexpensive tools, some tweezers and screwdrivers bought off Amazon, and even with those, it's totally possible to disassemble, service, and reassemble a watch. The reason I have fancier tools is because it's my job, and I do it day in and day out, over and over and over again. So I want to make that part of the experience have fewer variables. I want to know that all of my tools are perfect and exactly what I need. But if you're not doing something in a production environment as a professional, it's really not necessary. So I think maybe we will do an episode where I purchase some tools and show you how I work with those tools that are really inexpensive and accessible for pretty much everyone. With a fair number of your watches regularly entering the market as used pieces, and often without papers, have you given any thought to having a public database for models and serial numbers? That's a really interesting thought. I had not thought of that, but it is something that intrigues me, because I do have records for every single watch that I've made. I have the serial numbers, the date it was assembled. I also have the names of everyone who originally purchased them. And there are watches that I've sent all over the world over the past just over 10 years. And it's all in spreadsheets. So it could be possible to try and make some sort of online database, obviously withholding the individual's names. But I just haven't given it any thought. The original logbook I had was handwritten for the first, I think it was, year and a half. I have a handwritten book for every watch that I made. I would like to know, how do you prevent rust on your tools? Rust is a huge enemy, and it is something that I don't really think about now. But when I set up this workshop, I thought about rust. And you have to plan, because you really have to prevent rust in the first place. Because there are some tools that once they rust, they're useless. We cannot use them. Very hard to refinish them without compromising the tool. We definitely do not want any watch components to rust. So as far as inventory of parts goes, I have certain practices for making sure that they don't rust. A quick rundown of what I did for this workshop and the way I store things is I start by making sure that I have heat and air conditioning, because we're in a climate where it gets quite cold in the winter and very hot and humid in the summer. In the wintertime, I keep the heat on. And what that does is it keeps a stable or somewhat stable temperature within the workshop. And the heat dries the air. So even at night when I'm gone, the building is heated to about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. In the summer, when it's hot and humid, the air conditioning is running to keep the building cool. And the air conditioners remove humidity from the air and will drain that outside. So these are two really important aspects. If you work in a garage workshop or a warehouse environment, it's really hard to keep things from rusting, unless you happen to be in a very dry, arid climate, out in the desert maybe. But even then, there are cold nights, and these temperature fluctuations can lead to moisture depositing on surfaces. I also run a dehumidifier, and that dehumidifier drains the water out of the workshop as well. So what that does is it brings air in, will take water out of the air, and it will blow out dry air, which is going to be warm because it's drying it by heating it, and then it will drain out the moisture from that air. So this is always running, and it's set to a certain percentage for the relative humidity that I want. And I set that to 42%, which it's rare that we ever really get to 42% in this workshop, because we are in a climate where we really either have heat running, which the heat will be drying the air, or we have air conditioning running, which will also be drying the air. So the only time that that dehumidifier is really running often is in the springtime and in the fall. Today it was on because we have a really nice 60-degree day, so my heat has not been kicking on very much. Other things that we do, now that we've kind of controlled the air and the relative humidity in the workshop, we will put things like rust-inhibiting tabs. You can buy these from different machine tool supply companies and places like McMaster-Carr, MSC Direct, things like that. And these tabs have some chemicals in them that are released into the air. And so you'll put them in cabinets, drawers, in toolboxes. So if I have a wooden box with a staking set, inside of that wooden box, I will put one of these tabs. And it looks like a little plastic tab, and it emits a rust inhibitor. So that helps keep that one space rust-free for a certain period of time. So in the drawers where I keep my collets for the lathe, there are rust-inhibiting tabs inside of those drawers. So even though I'm controlling the relative humidity inside of the space quite well, I still want to make sure that inside of drawers and cabinets and inside of specific toolboxes where precise tools need to remain rust-free, I have extra precautions. Now, when I'm talking about inventory, if I've made a batch of 1,000 screws out of a certain steel, a carbon steel maybe, something that would easily rust, I will actually store those in an unfinished state in a jar with oil so that they are covered in oil and not exposed to air, not exposed to humidity. Once they are finished, polished, decorated, all of these things, whatever we're doing with these components, then they'll be stored in a container that has rust-inhibiting tabs. And of course, another really important thing, whenever we're handling tools and materials that might rust, I try to wear gloves or wipe down the parts after they've been touched by fingers, because the oils on our skin are actually corrosive. So we can cause rust and corrosion on certain materials just by touching them. If I take a piece of brass and I touch it with my finger, and then I set the brass aside for just a few days, I'll see a rusty fingerprint develop. So unless that component is going to be machined after the fact and that surface is going to be finished or removed, I will not handle it barehanded. So all of these precautions lead to pretty much a rust-free workshop. I'm curious on what is your take on polishing a watch when it comes in for service, and if it takes off too much material from the case. Should we just embrace the scratches? Now, that's definitely a personal opinion on the scratches and embracing them or repairing them. It also depends on who's wearing the watch, because I know people who are very, very particular with their watches and might even leave on protective plastic coating from when the watch was purchased new, just to try to avoid scratches on a surface. I also know other people that will wear their watch and hit every single door jamb that they come across. So some watches could be worn for many years and still look brand new with no scratches, just because the person wearing them takes such impeccable care not to get any scratches on them. Other watches could be worn for a few days and look like they've been through battle. So if your watch is always getting scratched, always getting dented and dinged up, then I wouldn't recommend polishing it regularly in order to bring it back to perfect condition. Because every time a surface is polished, what you're doing is actually lowering the level of material. You have to bring the surface all the way down to the deepest ding in order to make that ding disappear. So you're sanding off a lot of material if you have deeper scratches. So I myself kind of look at small scratches and wear and tear on a timepiece, and I think of it as adding character. So I usually don't recommend polishing watches unless it's something that is going to be resold and go to a new owner. This way, if a watch is expected to last 100 years maybe, and it changes hands every 20 years, you'll only have 5 different instances where it was polished. Because after that many polishings, you could start to see edge degradation, corners not as sharp, these sorts of things. Maybe the shape of bracelet links changing and morphing. It really depends on who's doing the polishing, though, and what kind of tools they have at their disposal. Because some advanced polishing techniques with all the right tools, those polishers will be able to maintain all of the shapes and maintain all of the corners and everything perfect. So it really boils down to preference, personal preference. And sometimes there are scratches that when you look down at your watch and you see them, they could be irritating. And if that's the case, I definitely say polish it, because I personally want to look at my watch and smile when I look at it. I want to be happy with what I see. I want it to bring me joy. So if joy is a perfectly polished bezel and flawless brushing, then you should have that. Thank you everyone for submitting questions. I'm always really excited to read the questions that people have, because I like to spread the knowledge of watchmaking and whatever people might think is kind of hidden or secretive in the watchmaking world, the watchmaking industry. So we will definitely do more Q&A, and make sure to submit your questions.